Good evening and welcome to the March 10, 2025 joint work session with the Mayor and Council and the Planning Commission. Tonight we have one topic for discussion, but it's a pretty big one. We're going to hear a presentation on the semi-annual population report and pipeline report. And we have Kirk Eby to lead us in it. And Kirk, take it away.
All right, thank you. And this is going to be a little bit of a long presentation. I'm not sure how long, hopefully only 30 minutes, but it might go a little bit longer, so just as a heads up. So good evening, Mayor and Council and Planning Commission. This is, as mentioned, a joint work session presentation about the city's population and pipeline reports. The modern version of the population report started around 2008, though there has been some flavor of it since the 1970s. And beginning in 2008, the population report has been expanded greatly by adding information about surrounding areas, more data points from the ACS and decennial census, and information about jobs and non-residential uses in the city. Staff created the pipeline report in 2006 and has refined it over the years to split the approved future development into projects that are likely to happen in the near future and projects that are longer in scope or no longer moving forward. And with that brief background and context, I will go ahead and move on to the main part of the presentation. And I do ask that you save all your questions until the end of the presentation, just so we can get through it.
We'll see if that works.
Yes. Doesn't hurt to ask, right? So I'm going to start off by explaining what each of the reports are and what they are not. So the population report utilizes various sources to create a one-stop shop for finding information about the people and jobs within the city of Gaithersburg and how those have changed over time. And as I previously mentioned, the population report dates back to 1973 when it was called the City Housing Survey. And the population report has usually been published twice per year since 1995. So the key thing to keep in mind is that the population report is not meant to be a real-time reporting tool. Staff is often asked about how Gaithersburg compares to other areas, and for that reason, the report does include information about nearby jurisdictions, the state of Maryland, and even the nation, the United States. And while most of the report is heavy on tables and numbers and other kind of mind-numbing facts and figures, there are some reference maps included to help bring everything back to its place in the real world. And in this presentation, I have added some charts and graphs to help make it a little less dense for all of you as well. So the pipeline report is a summary of all recent, current, and anticipated development within the city. It is published twice per year alongside the population report. So again, it is not intended to be a real-time development tracking tool. To help locate where development is occurring within the city, a map is included showing the location of the pipeline development projects. So I hope at least some of you are up there thinking, oh, this is great, thanks for putting this all together, but where could I get a copy? Well, both of them are available on the city's website as shown on this slide. So it's under the demographics page on the city webpage, and there's a link there, and I will have that link on the last slide again, so don't worry if you don't get to it right now, you'll be able to get to it at the end of the presentation. So now that you have that copy for yourself, you may be wondering, well, what could I do with these reports? Why are they so useful? Well, the reports are used by city staff and elected officials and the city boards and commissions and the general public for various purposes. But primarily, these serve as a go-to source for current and historic demographic, social, and economic information about both the city and the areas surrounding the city. And so now that I've talked about what the reports are and where to find them and what they can be used for, I'm going to go ahead and walk you through each of the reports, starting with the population report. And the next slides will go through that entire population report section by section. So the first section, sort of self-explanatory, the cover page and credits. But the most important items on these two pages are the report date and the publication date, because those tell you what time period you're looking at for the report and when that report was actually made available on the city's website. And that's the publication date, obviously. So note that the publication date is actually later than the report date because it does take time to compile all the information from the various sources and get that ready for publication. And during the presentation, there will be these little snapshots of the report pages here on the screen. And these are really meant to just provide context and kind of an overview of what the page looks like. They're not really meant to be read, so don't feel bad if you can't read the little text on there. But if you do want to take a closer look at the specific pages in the report, as I mentioned, you can use the web link, which again will be provided at the end of the presentation. So the next section is a table of contents, which again, self-explanatory. But what's nice about this is that in the PDF version, you can actually click on each of these little sections here, and it'll take you right to that section of the report, so you can quickly go. If you're interested in the housing sales or the decennial census for Maryland, you can just click there in the PDF, and it'll take you right to that topic. And the next section is the purpose and methodology and definitions. And this really just discusses the whole point of having this report. And then how all the estimates are created in the report, the methodology that's used to create that for the population and the housing estimates. And also all of the definitions and abbreviations used throughout the report. As planners, a lot of times we use a lot of abbreviations and we forget the general public, and even some of the mayor and council members may not know exactly all the acronyms we use, so we like to document that here so everybody is aware of it. And then we finally get to the first real page of substance in the report, which is this summary page. And if you were actually only going to look at one page in the whole population report, this is probably the page to look at. This page does provide a summary of all of the estimated population in the city, and it does give a breakdown by dwelling unit type. And there's also an estimate for the future population and future dwelling units based on the near-term development that's included in the population report. So the first two tables there on the right, the top and the middle one, those are just about the population of the city, and the top one does take into account the vacancy rates. So that estimate will usually try to reflect the actual population we believe is in the city based on the fact that, there are some vacant townhouses and detached houses and so on and so forth. The middle table assumes that there is no vacancy, and so if everything was filled up, this is what our population would be. So the top table really represents sort of a low estimate of the city population, and the middle table represents the high estimate of the city population. And then the bottom table is just summarizing the dwelling unit types, so that if you were interested in just knowing how much of the housing stock in the city is just townhouses, the existing housing stock, or even the future, what's been approved, how much of that is just townhouses, that's really the table to go to. And again, this image is just meant to show you sort of what it looks like on the page and not really meant to be read. So again, you can always look at the report to see the actual figures. So the key takeaways from the summary sheet. First of all, the city's estimated population on January 1st, 2025 is 73,092 persons. Now that's the city's estimate. And also the city's estimate of dwelling units is that we have 27,181 occupied dwelling units. And there's an estimated 1,278 vacant housing units, which is about 4.5% of all the units, which is a pretty low vacancy rate, actually. Rental apartments do make up the largest share of dwelling units within the city at about 41%, but they only account for about 34% of the population. Detached houses, on the other hand, are about 17% of the city's housing stock, but they account for about 22% of the population. So clearly, on average, you have more people living in a detached house than in an apartment, which kind of makes sense, right? So those two fun facts do reflect those vacancy rates and persons per unit factors that we use to calculate or to estimate the population, and each of those are unique by dwelling unit type. And now we're moving on to the American Community Survey section of the report. So the American Community Survey is conducted throughout the year by the Census Bureau, and it is sent to a random sample of the population. And it basically replaced, in the old decennial census, they had something called the long form, which was also sent to a sample of the population and collected a lot more information about social and economic and household things that the short form didn't collect. So the results of the ACS are released each year, and they do include, again, a wealth of social, demographic, and economic information for both the city and the surrounding areas. And the 1 year is only available down to and it's released in a 1-year ACS and a 5-year ACS. So the 1-year ACS is actually available down to the city level. The 5-year ACS is available for smaller census geographies, including things like tracts and block groups. And those smaller geographies allow the city to look at allow staff to look at the sub-city level using other tools like GIS. And so, for example, when we did the housing element of the master plan, you may remember we had some maps in there that showed at the block group level, the home ownership rates and the rental rates. So that's really what that's useful for. In the report, staff does include the past 2 non-overlapping 5-year ACS periods. And we also include the past 2 1-year ACS periods, but just for the city of Gaithersburg. And that's so you can look at the city, today, and then when it was 5 years ago, when it was 10 years ago, in the 5-year section, and then in the 1 year, obviously, for this year, and then the past year, and the year before that. As a side note, there was not a 1-year produced for the 2020 census. There was a 5-year produced. So if you look at some of the older reports, you might see that there'll be like the 2019 ACS, and then all of a sudden the 2021 ACS 1 year, and that's why the 2020 is missing, because it wasn't produced. Also, the city of Bowie, which is the 5th most populous incorporated city in Maryland, that is included in the 5-year ACS estimates in the report. But that city is too small to get the 1 year, so instead staff swapped in the Washington, D.C., because sometimes we are asked about, well, how does Gaithersburg compare to Washington, D.C.? So that's available in the 1 year, so at least you'll have something to look at if you were interested in how we compare to D.C. And a final note is that the 1 year and the 5-year ACS results are not directly comparable. So when you're looking at the city over time, or you're comparing the city to other areas, you want to be sure to use ACS years that match. So if you're looking at the 1 year ACS for Gaithersburg, make sure you're looking at the 1 year ACS for the other place that you're comparing to. Or if you're looking at the 2023 ACS 1 year for Gaithersburg, make sure you're looking at the 2021 ACS 1 year also for Gaithersburg, not the 5-year. The same thing with the 5-year. Make sure you're comparing 5-year to 5-year. So over the last 10 years, the 5-year ACS shows that the city's population has grown by about 12%, and the median age has increased by nearly 4 years. And unique characteristics of Gaithersburg, based on the ACS, include the large foreign-born population and the fact that we're a minority-majority city. So, the table on here is hopefully somewhat readable, and it does have that information I just explained or just talked about there. In addition to those fun facts, there are a few other things I wanted to bring to your attention from the ACS, and they're not shown in that little snippet there. So although the number of people speaking only English has decreased over the last 10 years, the percent of people speaking English less than very well has only increased slightly. So we're probably doing a very good job of making sure people are getting the education they need to speak English. The labor force participation has remained stable at around 73 or 74% over the last 10 years. And more city residents appear to be working within the city, the county, and the state now than they were 10 years ago. And that's probably a result of that significant increase in the percent of city residents who work from home. And in 2013, that was only about 3.5% of our residents, and now it's around 24%. So that's a dramatic increase, at least for now. Related to that increased number of people working from home, the percent of city residents driving alone in a car to work has also decreased from about 70% in 2013 to around 54% in 2023. And I can almost predict what your next question is. So the other key takeaway from the ACS is that it's always going to be about 2 years behind the current year. So the 2023 ACS is actually the most recent year that it's available. And that's because it obviously takes time for the census to send out the survey, collect the information, and then compile it and publish the results. So again, this is another reason that the report is not a real-time pulse on the demographic, social, and economic changes that may be occurring right now in 2025, both in Gaithersburg and in the surrounding areas. And it's also another reason that, sometimes we talk about ACS, and, again, in this report, it's the January 2025 report. So all of the city estimates are for January of 2025, but the ACS is from 2023. So again, there's that lag. So always keep that in mind too when you're looking at what the city's estimates are and what the ACS estimates are. So next we move on to the regional population census estimates portion of the report. And so the decennial census is the official population count of all people in the United States, and that is conducted every 10 years. And the primary purpose of that census, of course, is for apportioning the number of federal representatives for each state, right? The House of Representatives in Congress. And because that's primary mission is to count the number of people in the population, the decennial census doesn't really include a lot of the robust social and economic information that's part of the annual American Community Survey. And as I mentioned, from the 2000 census back, they had a long form that actually did collect more of that information as part of the 10-year census, but then, of course, you only got it every 10 years. So when they started the ACS back in the early 2000s, the idea was that it would be more timely so you could get that information on a yearly basis. And like the ACS, the decennial census obviously uses a survey form that they send out, but unlike the ACS, that survey form for the decennial census is sent to everyone, not just a sample of the population. And in addition to the decennial census and the ACS, Census Bureau has another program called the Population Estimates Program, and in that program they use a specialized methodology instead of a survey sent out to people, and they then estimate the population as of July 1st each year. And that one also, the population estimate program is also lags behind. I think the most recent for Gaithersburg is 2022, but I believe in May they're going to release the 2023, or is it? No, actually the most recent one's 2023, and then in May they're going to release the 2024 number. So again, it's a little bit behind. So these pages offer a quick way to compare Gaithersburg's population growth to the growth of other areas using sort of a apples to apples, right? Whether it's the decennial census or the population estimates program. So if you ever wanted to see, well, how is Gaithersburg growing compared to Maryland or DC Metro or the nation, this is a good page to go to. And the population estimates, again, as I mentioned, they're released in stages. And so, yeah, so in this one, only the state level information is available for the July 1st, 2024. So for Gaithersburg, it's July 1st, 2023. But again, that will be coming in May. And so once it's released, it'll be shown in the next population report. So in the July report, I will include the July 1st, 2024 population estimate from the census in that report. So next we move on to historic Gaithersburg population and housing section of the report. And these are the best pages to use if you're only interested in Gaithersburg's population and in dwelling unit information. So if you look closely, now this is when you start to look in the weeds a little bit, you'll note that the 2023 population estimates produced by the city are a little bit higher than what the American Community Survey and the population estimate programs show from the Census Bureau. So staff is looking into that to see if it's just reflective of different methodologies that we all are using, or if there's something else going on, or if we need to make some adjustments to how we estimate our population. So I just wanted to just let you know that we're aware of it and we are looking into it. And so here's an excerpt from that table that's in the report of just Gaithersburg and the population dwelling units. And this shows information back to the year 2010. So the full table in the report actually goes all the way back to the 1900 census, because that was the first census where they listed the city's population separately from everything else. So as you can see, we've been increasing our population since 2010, and we've also been adding a lot more housing units since then. And that we don't expect that to change much, at least in the short term. At least we hope it doesn't. So if you're looking for more detailed census information about the city, and this is going to be a little confusing because the page I just showed you, this is really just a summary of just population and dwelling units in the city. But there's also a page that has a lot more detail from each of these censuses, the decennial census, just for the city though. So if you're looking for that more detailed census information about just the city, then this is the go-to page. So if you need something other than just population dwelling units, this is really the best page to use. And there's some information on this page that goes back to the 1950 census, but most of it is really just the 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010, 2020 censuses. And in addition, the city staff does generate sort of an estimated January 2025 would be for this report for each of those things that are included in the 1980 through 2020 census. So if one of those data points is the gender, right, the percent male, female, we do an estimate for as of January 1st, what that would be, or if it's the population 65 and over, we do an estimate for that. And that's really just based on looking at, the change from 2010 to 2020, and if that sort of continued, what would it end up being in 2025? Capped for, the whole overall population can only be whatever, so there's a little more to it, but basically, that's what we're looking at for that particular part of the report. And actually, speaking of the population 65 and over, so So on January 1st, 2025, it's estimated to be 13.3%, which is a little bit up from the 2020 census figure of 13.1%. And again, that's just a linear sort of estimate. So, key takeaways from all of that census information about the city. So the three largest growth periods for the city were 1950 to 60, 1960 to 70, and 1970 to 1980. And those are reflected on that middle chart shown above, or I guess sort of the bottom chart. Following 1980, the city's growth rate declined, and it has been leveling off. And the latest rate was about 16% for the 2010 to 2020 period. Through 1980, the growth in housing units actually increased faster than population growth, but both of them have been increasing at a similar rate since then. So, and the other chart on the right is really just, the numerical increase in population and dwelling units, whereas the bottom one is just that rate of change. And you can see again that peak in 1950 or 1960 through 1980, and then sort of we've leveled off since then. So now that you know everything about the city of Gaithersburg, have you ever wondered what's happening around the area and the surrounding area? So these historic census information for the DC area pages, these are the pages to go to if you did want to find out what's been happening in Montgomery County or the DC metro area or the nation. And so these pages compile statistics from past decennial censuses, with most of the information going back to either the 1910 or the 1940 census. It just depends on, some information isn't available back before a date. For example, the metropolitan area, I believe they didn't actually do that before around 1920, so there may not be anything before then. So key takeaways from all of that census information for the area around Gaithersburg is that the city's population as a proportion of the county and the DC region has remained fairly constant since 2000. So that indicates that the city's steady growth is really keeping up with the growth that's happening in the surrounding area. And this little chart here on the right just shows the population since 1970 of the city, and also the city's percent of Montgomery County's population. And you can see, again, it sort of shot up between 1970 and 1990, and then it's kind of remained about the same since then. So we've been growing about the same as the county since then. So the next section of the report is the development trends and permit information. And this provides information about dwelling units approved, the number of permits issued, number of permits completed, and the dwelling units that have been demolished. And this information goes back to around the year 2000. It's not quite complete to the year 2000. That was when the city had switched from, I guess, more of a paper system to an electronic system. So around the middle of 2000, it goes back to. Approved dwelling units are based on approved entitlement development plans. So that would be like schematic development plans, preliminary site plans, final site plans, amendments to final site plans, things like that. Issued dwelling units are based on the issued dates that are found in the city's permit system. And the completed and demolished units use the finaled dates, as they're called, in the city's permit system. And the table on this slide is for completed units and shows peak and lull cycle of residential construction in the city. So that lull has sort of completed units started around 2020. Then there was a peak around 2021, 2022, and then another lull through 2023. Then we had a little spike in the first half of 2024, and now it seems to kind of be more of a lull at the moment, at least. But staff does expect a lot of units to be completed over the next 2 to 4 years. So we'll probably end up going back to another peak as projects like One Central and the Stevenson Met Grove and the Spectrum and, of course, Lake Forest all come online. Those will probably shoot us back up into a nice big peak there. And so, speaking of the peaks and lulls, so this graph actually visually shows that nature of construction being sort of up and down since 2000, and that's based on the permits in the report. And it shows that the peak period, at least in the last 25 years or so, was between 2002 and 2004 for the city. And it'll be interesting to see if the next peak period that happens with Lake Forest and all the other things coming, if that actually exceeds what was happening in that period of 2002 to 2004. So we'll see if we are able to beat that or not. And then if you've ever wondered, geez, yeah, how much, everybody talks about that high cost of housing, but how much does it really cost around here, this is the page to go to, the median sale price of houses section of the report. So the median sales price information is compiled from various sources, including Maryland Association of Realtors and the Treasury Department at the U.S. And unfortunately, that information is really not available for just the city of Gaithersburg, and it's also not available for different housing types. So it is available for the county, for the state of Maryland, for the DC Metro, and for the U.S., which is all included in the report. And then, in addition to all of that, it also gives a percent of increase in the price and everything. But it also shows the consumer price index and the real gross domestic product, sort of as a guide for how is housing compared to those two other data points. And the gross domestic product comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, and the consumer price index comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So those are both federal agencies. So we thank them for providing that for everyone. So as this chart shows, the sale prices in the county and the state and the nation and the DC metro area, they all continue to increase. And prices in Montgomery County and the DC metro, as you can see on the chart, they're much higher than what you see in the state of Maryland and in the U.S. So that just sort of drives home the point that it is expensive to live in Montgomery County. And by extension, we assume that in Gaithersburg, that holds true as well. And if you looked at the ACS, there is a median value included in there for homeowners that they sort of self-report, but it does show it's higher than than the state and the nation. So, and it's closer to. It is a little bit lower than Montgomery County's, but it is still close to Montgomery County's median. So, we also provide a section that lists the population and dwelling units estimates for each subdivision or neighborhood, if you want to call it that, within the city. So if you've ever wondered how many townhouses there are in Montgomery Meadows, or how many condos there are in Section 2 of Newport Estates, or how many people are living in Long Draft Oaks, these are the pages to look through. And the larger subdivisions will also include information about each phase, section, or neighborhood, so each sort of sub-piece of the subdivision. And so here's two examples of the information included in the subdivision section of the report. And so if you look closely, you'll find out that, there's 458 townhouses in Montgomery Meadows, and there's about 39 people living in Long Draft Oaks. So now you know. And the big takeaway from the subdivision section of the report is that there are a lot of subdivisions in the city. And so there's a few more fun facts about these subdivisions in the city on the slide there. And before you ask, Old Town is actually the largest subdivision by dwelling units. Now, of course, we're cheating a little bit here because Old Town is something we've sort of defined, right? It wasn't really a traditional subdivision in the sense of like Kentlands and all of those. But Old Town does have 2,387 units, and that's just a little bit more than the second one, which is probably more of what you would think of as a subdivision, and that's Crown. So Crown has 2,203 units. Now, Kentlands is the largest subdivision by population, though, which is interesting. So it's got 5,592 persons, which is just edging out Old Town, which has 5,496 people. So a couple of fun facts there for you as well. So the report does include a list of dwelling units that have an income restriction, an age restriction, or both an age and income restriction. The income restricted units include moderately priced dwelling units, or MPDUs, and also the workforce housing units, or WFHUs, that are under the city's affordable housing program, and also includes other units that have income restrictions because of financing or deed covenants or other reasons. So the age-restricted units are also sometimes called senior units or senior living units. So that's just so that we know when we say, sometimes we'll say senior units instead of, or senior housing instead of age-restricted, but that's really what we're talking about. So the key takeaways from those restricted units, almost 6% of all city dwelling units are income restricted, and more than 13% of all city rental units are income restricted. And almost 8% of all city dwelling units are age restricted, and nearly 13% of all city rental units are age restricted. And there are 434 units that are both age restricted and income restricted, and all of those are rental units. And the units with both that age and income restriction represent about 1.5% of all the city units, and almost 4% of all the rental units in the city. And of note, all of the age-restricted units are multifamily rental apartments, except for the duplexes and a couple of detached houses that are available only there at the Asbury Methodist Village. So everything else is rental. So in addition to a tally of housing units and population in the city, the report includes a limited amount of information about jobs and non-residential space, and that can be found on this non-residential floor area estimates page in the report. From 2008 to the present, jobs have varied from a high of about 50,000 jobs to the current low of around 46,000 jobs. Although it's probably lower during the COVID era, it's kind of hard to estimate, but it probably did dip below the 46,000. The total non-residential building area in the city has not fluctuated much over that period, so it's remained between about 19 million and 20 million square feet since 2008. So, as things have been constructed, other things have been either demolished or just remained vacant, like Lake Forest Mall is a good example of a big vacant building right now. So the other uses that are shown in the table, that includes things like government, schools, hotels, religious facilities, and other uses that really don't fit into any of those other categories. Biotech uses like Novavax and AstraZeneca, those are often divided between both the office and the research and development categories because a lot of times they'll have both office and lab space in their buildings. So that's another quick fun fact there. So retail and office are the two largest non-residential uses in the city. And as I previously mentioned, the total number of jobs has varied from about 46,000 to 50,000 since 2008. And the total non-residential building area has only fluctuated by around 1 million square feet. And because the city has been building more residential units since 2008, the jobs to housing ratio and the jobs to household ratio, those have been declining since 2010 because residential construction has, basically been outpacing non-residential construction and job growth. And that's what this chart here on the right shows. It's got both the jobs for household in blue and the jobs for dwelling unit in red. And it just sort of shows how it was, going up a little bit between 2008 and 2010, and it's pretty much been, going down since then, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. And why is that? Well, you may be wondering, why do we care about these jobs ratios, right? And why do we include these in the report? Well, those jobs for household ratio can be used in conjunction with something like the labor force per household to determine whether an area has a balance of jobs, since the number of jobs available in an area should, and somehow match the number of labor force participants. So basically you have one job for every labor force participant, right, in some kind of ideal world. And the jobs for dwelling unit, that ratio is usually, it's similar, but it's uses the dwelling units instead of households, since dwelling units are often easier to count than figuring out households, because the way you figure out households is you either do a survey or you just assume some kind of vacancy rate. And of course, households can vary based on, how many people live in each house type and whatnot. And that's particularly true of multifamily apartments, which can vary quite a bit, not just from vacancy, but also how many people are living in each one. Typically as apartments age, the persons per housing unit actually increases as they get older because they become more affordable. So you see more families living in the older apartments, and so then you have a higher persons per dwelling unit. So when you are using a jobs per dwelling unit ratio, that really should be compared to the labor force per dwelling unit ratio rather than labor force per household. It's also important to note that, while we talk about jobs and housing and balance and all of that, one area may have some kind of a surplus of jobs because the surrounding area actually has a deficit of jobs, right? And when you take those two areas together, you find out that there is a balance. So the number of jobs available does actually match the number of labor force participants that are also out there. And as an example, Gaithersburg has a jobs to household ratio of about 1.6. That's what staff's estimating. And that is higher than what the census ACS is telling us, the labor force per household ratio of 1.4. And of course, labor force, it doesn't mean you actually have a job, it just means you're in the labor force, right? You might be unemployed. So the other one to look at in the ACS is the actual workers per household, which is actually lower than the 1.4. But staff does note the surrounding areas like Potomac and Montgomery Village and Darnestown and Germantown, they all have a lower jobs per household ratio, so they have a deficit. And so when you look at the mid-county area as a whole, it's very close to actually being balanced. And Montgomery County as a whole also is pretty close to being balanced. So it has a estimated jobs per household ratio of 1.3. And that's lower than the labor force household ratio of 1.4, but it does almost match the worker per household ratio of 1.33. So it's probably in balance in some way. But just being in balance doesn't mean that, oh, everybody who's living in Montgomery County works in Montgomery County, obviously. So we still have some, people living in Montgomery County, living in the city, working in, DC or Virginia or even Pennsylvania or wherever, and vice versa. So, but it is a good measure, a good sort of ballpark measure of whether you have enough housing and enough jobs for the number of jobs you have. That's really the other side of it. So the city does participate in the Regional Cooperative Forecast, which is coordinated by the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, or MWCOG, as all of you know. The Cooperative Forecast is an estimate of the expected growth in jobs, households, and population over the next 25 to 30 years. Round 10 is the most current forecast for the DC metro area, including the city, and it does go out to the year 2050. The report includes forecasts from MWCOG for Gaithersburg, city of Rockville, Montgomery County, and the MWCOG region, which is not exactly the same thing as the DC metro area because they use a little bit smaller region for what they're doing. And that's because they do transportation modeling, and so they do a little bit less than the actual MSA, as it's called. And so we also have a page in there about these traffic analysis zones, and you're probably thinking, what is a traffic analysis zone? Well, the main mission of MWCOG is to actually help the DC metro area meet its air quality standards and reduce overall air pollution in the region. At least that's one of its main missions. And one of the strategies that's used to facilitate that reduction in air pollution is to actually build projects, transportation projects with federal funding that help reduce vehicle congestion and vehicle use. And of course, there's not enough federal transportation funding to build all the projects that we would love to build, right? All the member jurisdictions would like to build. So COG uses transportation modeling to evaluate those various projects and their impact on actually reducing congestion and vehicle use, which by extension then, how much will that reduce pollution and improve air quality. And in order to facilitate that transportation modeling, COG and the member jurisdictions have cooperatively created these traffic analysis zones, or TAZs. And it's a smaller geography, within each of the counties, basically. And each TAZ includes the population, the number of households, the number of jobs by what's called OREO type, or office, retail, industrial, and other type of job. And there's also another factor in there, which is what's called a mode split. So how many people are likely to drive a car versus walking versus taking transit, all of that stuff. So households and population are basically considered, traffic generators, so that they'll generate trips. And then the jobs are considered traffic attractors, so they will attract trips. And so based on all the information in each TAZ, the COG's transportation model can basically predict how many trips will begin and end at each TAZ, and how many of those trips will be made by a vehicle. And then they place those vehicle trips on the road network to estimate how much traffic and congestion will be on each road segment. And again, then they sort of do a baseline of that, and they'll take different proposed projects, see how that impacts it. So really these TAZs are very important for all that transportation modeling and for evaluating the transportation system and changes to that system that are proposed to use federal funding and all of that. But in summary, the TAZs are not usually used directly by the city, but they are included in the report as a reference so that you would have that information in case you're ever wondering, oh, well, what is this TAZ population and how many jobs are in there? And that brings me to the next slide, which actually has the map of the TAZs there for you to look at. And so the map there shown on the slide, along with the jobs for household and jobs for dwelling unit ratios for the current report date and the 2050 forecast date are included in the report. And as shown on this table on the slide, the city's jobs to household ratio and jobs to dwelling unit ratios are expected to increase by the year 2050. So in the January report, we're showing the jobs for dwelling unit at 1.64, jobs for household at 1.74. And when you look at the forecast through 2050, by 2050, it's expected that the jobs for housing unit will increase to 2.05 and the jobs for household will increase to 1.97. So again, in the bigger scheme of things, the city is, somewhat of an attractor, a jobs center. And then around us are areas that don't have as many jobs, so there's people that live there, and they have a jobs deficit. So again, on balance in the mid-county area, we do think that it's, even with this growth in our jobs to housing ratio in the city, we still think it'll be a balance, because, there's a lot of residential growth happening around us, for example, like Clarksburg, and even in Germantown and Montgomery Village to some degree. So as I mentioned, the city is projected to continue growing through 2050, with jobs, households, and population all increasing at about the same pace as the region overall. And on an earlier slide, I'd sort of mentioned that that's why we sort of been keeping our percent of the, our proportion of the city, of the region's population and the jobs sort of has remained about the same, and that's because we're basically growing along at the same pace as the region. So there's also another page in the report that does include subdivision land density. So unlike this other subdivision section that was really just talking about population and dwelling units, this section actually looks at the population density and the housing unit density for just a select number of subdivisions, along with the city overall as a whole. And population density is normally expressed in something like persons per square mile. But in the report, we've also included the persons per acre. Sometimes that's used as well, and the dwelling units per acre. And also for comparison to places in the rest of the world, we also include the persons per square kilometer. So sometimes people are looking at, in Europe it's like this, or in South America, and so most other places around the world do use something like population per square kilometer. And again, in addition to the population density, we do have the dwelling unit density, which again has dwelling units per acre, as well as dwelling units per hectare, which again, hectare is the one that's used in the rest of the world. So key takeaways from the density, the population density part. The city's overall density is about 6,663 persons per square mile, and that's based on the vacancy, the occupied dwelling units. And it could be as high as 7,312 units per square mile or persons per square mile if you discount the vacant units or assume there are no vacant units in the city. And there's a little interesting fact there about Baltimore City being about 7,000 persons per square mile because it has lots in population. So it's just interesting that the city of Gaithersburg is getting very close to the Baltimore City's density, even though when you drive through Baltimore, you may not see it that way, but Baltimore City obviously is also a much larger land area than the city of Gaithersburg.
Well, if you counted vacant units, Baltimore is much denser than.
That is absolutely true too. Yes, Baltimore definitely has a lot more of that. But of course, Baltimore City in the past was much denser when it had almost, in 1950, it had over 900,000 people, and it was like 11,000 people per square mile. It was much denser. And the table that's shown on this slide, which is in the report, it does include that higher, as if everything was built out, because really the idea is to really show the maximum density that could possibly be in Gaithersburg, not to show more of the vacancy being in there. And just for comparison, Washington D.C. currently has a population density of over 11,000 people per square mile, so we're not quite there. We're not quite near D.C.'s density. And D.C. actually had a peak also in 1950, and it was about over 13,000 people per square mile. So it's come down a little bit, but not as dramatic as Baltimore, obviously dropping from almost 12,000 people per square mile down to the 7,000. And back to the city of Gaithersburg, although it's much less densely populated east of I-270 compared to west of I-270, that will likely start to change as all this near-term development begins building out. So once you have Lake Forest and Spectrum and One Central and Casey Rosedale, it's very likely that the density east of I-270 will get a lot closer to the density that's west of I-270. There are a few projects west of I-270, like the Stevenson Met Grove, and there's maybe Watkins Mill Town Center will move along. The Nike missile site's over there, which we know that's probably coming in, and the Kentlands Apartments, which I think is also coming in. But taken all together, those are a fair number of units, but compared to, especially just Lake Forest on the east side, I mean, there's a lot more units happening on the east side right now. So again, we do think that the density of the city east of I-270 will catch up to the density west of I-270. And it is interesting to note too that the land area east of I-270 is a little bit smaller than the land area west of I-270, as you can see on the slide there. It's about 47% of the city's land east and about 54% west. And so that concludes the population report, believe it or not. So the next slides are going to go through the pipeline development report, which is a much smaller report, and really saying we're going through it section by section, but there's really not that many sections. So it's obviously a cover page and credits. This is new this year. And again, the most important takeaways from this are the publication date and the report date. And really, this was added this year because, we've been providing these as two separate PDFs over the last several years, and it just sort of made sense that someone who downloads just the pipeline report is just getting a bunch of tables and not this extra information to kind of put it in context. So we decided to add that this year. So the active development pipeline is the first section of the pipeline report, and if you're looking for information about the near-term projects that are likely going to be completed within the next 10 years, these are the pages to look at. So each project includes a map reference number in the table so that you can find it on the pipeline map, which is coming up in another section. And there are a lot of colors on this page as well, and that's because each of those colors represents a different year when a project was completed. And projects that have not begun construction or that are currently under construction, they don't have any color shading, so they're just like a white background. And that helps to quickly identify which projects are completed and which ones are not completed. The inactive development pipeline is the next section, and that contains information about the potential development projects and inactive development projects, which are not likely to be built within the next 10 years. So all of the inactive projects have an approval and could be constructed, sooner if market conditions were to change or if whatever other factors that are keeping them from moving forward change. And then I mentioned these potential development projects. So those are also, sometimes we call them anticipated development projects. So those are projects that we know are coming, but they don't have actually an entitlement approval. But they may have received something like a sketch plan or some similar approval like that, a concept plan, something like that. So we know that we're pretty confident they are going to come in. So as an example, I mentioned Lake Forest earlier. So if you look at the July 2024 report, you'll find out that that's actually in this inactive potential development pipeline, because at that time it only had sketch plan approval. It did not have the schematic development plan approval. So now that it received schematic development plan approval, that has been moved into the active development pipeline part of the report. So that's just a quick explanation of why you might see something in the inactive or the potential pipeline report and wonder, why is it in that section and not in the active? And that's an explanation of why. Sometimes there'll be things in there that we know are coming. And I think we've shaded those as gray, just sort of, again, to highlight them, to say, hey, these are real projects that are probably going to be moved up to the other report pretty soon. And so, as I promised, there is a map of the active and inactive or potential pipeline development projects that's included in the pipeline report. So again, the numbers on the map correspond to the numbers that are in the table for the pipeline development projects for both the active and the inactive. And the projects on the map are color-coded. So the pink projects are the ones that are in the active pipeline, and the purple projects are on the ones that are in the inactive or the potential projects pipeline. And the last section of the pipeline report is a near-term population and dwelling unit projection for the next 5 to 10 years, and that's based on the active pipeline development projects. And those projections are based on what staff has observed, the trends in past issuance and completions of projects. So we look at how long has it normally taken for a townhouse, after the permit's issued for it to be completed. And we sort of look at, there's 10 more that are supposed to be coming, so we think those will be done in the next 6 months, because it typically is 6 months or less to complete a townhouse after the permit's been issued. So that really gives you a quick, pretty good idea of, over the next 5 years, what's going to happen with population and dwelling units in the city. So again, the active pipeline consists of those projects that have received entitlements, and so they have a preliminary site plan, or schematic development plan, or similar, and those are very likely to be completed in the next, 5 to 10 years. Well, next 10 years, we'll say. Could be the next year even. The active pipeline projects include things like Lake Forest, One Central, Spectrum, KC Rosedale, all of those. On the west side, you've got the KC. Or not the case, the Stevenson Met Grove. I don't know why it's not coming to me. The inactive pipeline, on the other hand, is made up primarily of approved development projects that are on hold or unlikely to move forward in the next few years. And that includes things like the fairgrounds, which we know has a sketch plan, but still is a fairgrounds. Probably still will be the fairgrounds for a while. And again, that inactive pipeline also does include some of those anticipated development projects that we expect will move forward in the next 10 years, but they don't actually have entitlements. So like the Nike site is one of those that's in that anticipated development category. And then that near-term growth table, of course, shows what we expect in the next 5 years. And of course, development, like in the population report, we talked about the permits and the tracking of that and how it sort of goes up and down, and that's kind of what happens with the development pipeline too. A lot of times we have ups and downs, ups and downs. You can see here that there are about 3,500 new dwelling units that are in the active pipeline and over 6,700 new units that are in the inactive and anticipated pipeline. And in addition to all those new units, there's actually 25 what we call replacement units that are in the active pipeline. So those are units that are being reconstructed because of, some kind of damage, could be fire damage, could be a tree fell on a house, something like that. So not many of those, but there are some of those in there as well. And so this slide summarizes the changes that we made for the January 2025 reports, and the two changes of note are the new cover page, as I mentioned, for the pipeline report. And also we added another data point to the 1 year and the 5 year ACS, and that is for the number of federal workers. And in case you're wondering, about 10% of workers in the city are employed by the federal government, and about 13% of county workers are employed by the federal government. And in the DC metro area, about 14% of workers are federal employees. So those are hot topic right now. And in conclusion, or in summary, population pipeline reports are a good starting point to see where the city is, where it has been, and where it's going in terms of social, economic, and demographic characteristics, and also a good starting point to look at the city versus areas surrounding the city and the county and the state and the DC metro area. And so that is the end of my presentation. And as promised, the slide does have the link to the city's demographic webpage where both of those reports can be found online. And I am happy to answer any questions, and I hope that didn't take too long.
Thank you very much, Kirk. Very, very meaty set of reports. But I think I kind of like the way that you did it, which is it's kind of part tour of how the reports work, and then a little bit of a teaser as to what sort of data is in the reports that we're all interested in. And I think it's important to stress just how important the data is, or the data are, if you're getting super grammatical. Because we use it in our planning processes, we use it for master planning, we use it for allocation of resources and services, and probably in any number of other ways every single day. And that sort of brings me to a question that I don't expect you to have the answer to. It's kind of more rhetorical, but you at the end you mentioned the federal workforce. We rely a lot on the Census Department for at least the population parts of this of your presentation, and it begs the question, like, what's the status of the Census Bureau?
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's being targeted, but man, it's so important what they do. Obviously, it's the function is in the Constitution, but I just don't know. But go ahead, Kirk.
Yeah.
If you want to take a stab at that.
Yeah, I'm not privy to what's happening at the Census Bureau, but I know I guess it was reported in the news that so the census had put together a volunteer advisory board to help them with planning the 2030 census, and my understanding is that board was dismissed in the last few days. So hopefully
Okay.
they have enough. They got enough out of that board to move forward with their 2030 census planning. But I would hope that this information would still be an important part of the Census Bureau's mission, and that Congress would recognize that it needs to continue. Because, it's, some of this is, for Congress, right? I mean, they also
Yeah.
have funding that they want to allocate. They want to make sure they're allocating it fairly and whatnot.
And they have to do redistricting and all that
Right.
sort of stuff.
Right, yeah.
Which is true. I would think that as technologies there are more and more available technologies at lower and lower cost points, that if it was necessary at some point, there would probably be some ways that we could estimate things without the Census Bureau at some point, but hopefully it never comes to that. And then my second question before I turn it over to council members and planning commission, I read a year or two ago that the county had not been reporting accurate numbers of building permits to the Census Bureau over the years. I'm assuming that the city of Gaithersburg has been reporting accurate building permit numbers. Is that correct?
I'm not sure that's 100% correct, unfortunately, but we, when that was happening at the county, we did look into, what we were doing, and we sort of realized that we maybe weren't doing as much as we should. So we did reach out to the Census Bureau, and at this point, they definitely have our information. We are reporting to them all of our building permit information. So they do have ours, and they're getting it correctly. So I think we'd asked them to go back and look at some of the ones, because we sent them some older stuff too that we thought maybe they had missed, and I think we'd asked them to look at that. I'm not sure if they did. Hopefully they did. But
Hopefully so.
yeah.
Okay. Who wants to go next? Neil Harris.
Okay, so first of all, I'd like to note that living in Gaithersburg, in the last 10 years, the median age of the population has only gone up 4 years. So I'm going to assume that my age will only go up 4 years over the next 10.
I'm with you on that, Neil. I like that.
An advantage of living in Gaithersburg. One comment that you don't have to respond to, but when you talk about the surrounding area, I'm wondering if at some point we get data on what I would call greater Gaithersburg, people who think they're in Gaithersburg or nearby and use Gaithersburg shopping.
Right. So one way that we could do that, we could look at like zip code. So for 20877 and 20879, those are pretty compact still, even though they're beyond the city. 20878 is a little more challenging because that's a very large zip code. It goes all the way down to the Potomac River, includes all of North Potomac.
Yeah, we'd have
and
to
things
look at
like that.
census tracts.
But that is another way to look at it, because, the post office would say 20878 is just Gaithersburg, even though they will accept North Potomac and Darnestown as cities for that. zip
Yeah, I
code.
think it might be interesting to know what's happening in our immediate surroundings rather than just looking at other municipalities. So some years ago, it's long enough ago where Tanisha wasn't with us just yet, we did the visioning exercise, and it was pointed out by our former city manager that we don't really have enough room to handle all the jobs and all the population that we're projected to have. This report seems to indicate that we, at least on the population side, we have room for people, but it seemed like we needed to make choices, and the direction that we were discussing at the time, although it hasn't become part of the city's official strategy, is that people are better than jobs because we get more tax revenue from individuals. We can afford to do more services and things like that. So are we looking at that strategically as what really works, and can we pay the bills in 25 years if we go along this line?
I think that would be something that the Economic Development Department would probably look at. In terms of, from, city planning side of things, is there room for everything? That's always a great question to ask. And a lot of that comes back to, well, how dense are you willing to build? How tall are you willing to build? Things like that really answer that more. I mean, if you look at Gaithersburg, even along, Lake Forest is a great example, right? That was 1.5 million square feet or wherever of retail. a giant building surrounded by a huge parking lot, right? And the new plan is that you're going to have somewhere around 800,000 square feet of retail, and then some, 600,000 or 700,000 square feet of jobs space, and then, some housing and stuff there too. So now you're reusing that land much more densely and much more efficiently than what was there before, and you're not going to have a giant parking lot. So a lot of it is, there's opportunities like that, I think, in more areas of the city where you could utilize the land to a greater degree than what's being done today. And so in terms of fitting everything, there's probably a way to fit everything. I'm not sure that's that much of an issue, although I understand what you're saying about, what are the appropriate uses to fit in. And I think, again, that's more of an economic development question. I know there's sort of two sides or two arguments about that. One is that, you don't want any people because they demand services and that costs money. And all you want are the jobs because they pay taxes and all this. But unlike other states, the city of Gettysburg doesn't get like sales tax directly, things like that.
We don't get income tax.
But we do
from
get
the company.
we do get some kind of share of with the income tax. So that might be why the residents is, and I'm sure it's kind of a balance. I mean, you really kind of want, I would think, as a city, you want a little of everything, right?
I think
to be a
that- yeah,
well-rounded city.
No, I agree. You want to mix ideally, you want the numbers to work as well.
Right.
All right, thank you.
Rob?
Sure. Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Kerr, for the presentation. The data is enlightening. Just a question on the future projection. I guess it's MWCOG's data. It talks about, it looks like Rockville will outstrip us in population growth over the long term and somewhat on job growth as well. Does that take into account projections on existing projects and future projects in the pipeline? Does it take into account maximum expansion limits and the opportunity for annexation? How do they?
Right. So the pipeline, to be frank about it, the pipeline actually has more growth than what's shown in the forecast through 2050. So we've actually got a lot more, especially when you look at the inactive. The active is all in there, but the inactive is actually taking us well beyond that. So there is, when staff is working with COG and other jurisdictions on the forecast, one of the things we also have to keep in mind is that just because you've approved something doesn't mean it's actually going to be built, right? There's something called the market, and there has to be demand, and there has to be a need for it. So we're always sort of balancing all of that. In terms of the MEL, we don't really include that in our forecast because really we're just looking at the city of Gettysburg and its boundary. So that's not included.
Is there a way to, because based on the September session or the fall session, I don't remember if it was September or not, one of the priorities that was focused on by the council was annexation strategy. And so is there a way to take a holistic look at population growth and job growth as a function of not just organic growth or development within the city, but also as tying it in with that broader look that we were talking about last fall?
There probably is a way. I mean, in the existing municipal growth element, it does look at, just the city and then the city plus the MEL in terms of population growth and whether there's enough infrastructure to serve all of that. So that is something that we could look at. Staff would note that a lot of the area that's within the maximum expansion limits is, already built out residential areas that are unlikely to change. So in terms of, certainly you could, if it was annexed, it would have a population growth impact to the city. But in terms of, annexation growth plus then additional growth from redevelopment, that might be less likely to happen for some areas in the MEL. There may be some opportunities there. Obviously, we saw with Walnut Hill, that was annexed in. They really haven't looked at doing, a lot of additional improvements now. But over the long term, it's possible that there may be some additional density, that would happen there, whether it's non-residential or residential or whatever. So, and then in terms of Rockville, basically having stronger population growth and having more dwelling units and things. A lot of the reason that Rockville is looking at that or predicting that is, they have 3 metro stations, whereas we don't. So the idea is that around the metro stations, there's probably going to be a lot more density. There might be more jobs, although I think for their metro stations, I believe, the downtown, the Rockville station, I think that's where they sort of see more jobs happening. And I think the other two, the Twin Brook and Shady Grove, are more, residential focused in those two
Well,
areas.
but Shady Grove's not in Rockville yet. And so
Not
that's
yet, but
part
there
of-
are some properties that have been annexed into Rockville that are adjacent. The one apartment building that's already built there, the Bainbridge, I think it's called. And then across the street, the old CarMax, I believe they annexed that property as well. But yeah, they are actually looking at the metro station itself as another, the Rockville station, obviously, and the Twin Brook station are both within Rockville. And they have, Twin Brook, they have quite a large plan. Obviously, the Wegmans with the apartments above it is currently under construction, although I think the apartments part of it is completed. But they have 3 or 4 more buildings they're looking at putting there. And I know they've been talking, there's been some talk, I think, in that area too about some of the shopping plazas redeveloping as well. So kind of like what happened with Pike and Rose, right? That was a giant, back to the Lake Forest model, right? It was, the Pike and Rose originally was a strip mall, shopping center with a giant parking lot, and it was redeveloped into the Pike and Rose, which has, several high-density buildings and lots of residential and things that weren't there before. And so that's, again, I think in terms of fitting everything, as Councilmember Harris was mentioning, I think that's really the way you fit stuff in the city is we're gonna have to have more density and less parking lots, maybe.
Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you so much for the presentation. A lot of data there. Policy wonks are going to have a lot to chew on for quite a while. I wanted to discuss the 2 pipelines a little bit more and just make sure that I'm clear on what gets something from an inactive to an active. So you mentioned that the inactive pipeline is something that has been approved sketch plan, but does not have an STP, right? And then once you have an STP, it moves into active?
So, right, and that's more of the potential. So like Nike site, for example, that has a sketch plan, but it hasn't moved to the next stage to get the schematic development plan, so it's still sort of in that inactive group. But most of the plans in the inactive group, they actually do have entitlements. It's just that we haven't seen any movement on them.
Okay.
And they might be projects that we know there's not going to be movement on. I don't want to use this as an example. What's the one that comes to mind? Cities Aquatic Center, right? Over on Darnestown Road. That's an example. Well, there's an approved site plan, but I don't think that the city has, any plans to move forward anytime soon. So it could happen someday in the future, but for now it's over there. So Fairgrounds, that was another one where, again, they just have a sketch plan, so that's more of the sort of potential moving forward. But there are some other projects in there. There was this idea that Executive Gardens would be redeveloped into a new apartment building. And again, they have schematic development plan approval, but that project doesn't, and that's probably been, more than 15 years. So that's another example of a project that probably is not moving forward.
I just find it fascinating. I mean, we've been saying the number roughly 5,000 approved units in the pipeline, but really it's 3,500 active, but over 10,000 when you combine the inactive
Correct.
and
Correct.
the inactive. The mayor likes to use the phrase that Gaithersburg punches above its weight when compared to other places in the county when adding housing, improving housing, and these numbers certainly bear that out. I did want to just touch on the federal employee numbers and the fact that it's 10% of our population. I mean, if the percentages that we're hearing from, the news reports, we could be seeing, between 2,000 and 3,000 Gaithersburg residents losing their federal jobs in the next couple of months. So that's certainly concerning. And I pray that math does not hold up. And
Yeah, I know what you're saying. So I guess, I think there's sort of this idea at the federal level that maybe they want to reduce the workforce by around 10%. So if 10% of the city's workers are federal workers and then 10% of that gets reduced, that's about 1%, right? So if we've got around 35,000 workers in the city, something like that, 1% of that is, I don't know if I can do this math in my head, around 350. That's still a lot. I mean, it's not like I'm downplaying it. I'm just saying that it is still a certain number. And it's hard to say, it depends on what kind of jobs and certainly there's probably some federal jobs that might be easier for someone to, move from the federal job to a non-federal job. Unfortunately, those are probably the jobs that are more common, maybe lower paying, right? The more specialized jobs, like we hear about the nuclear scientists being let go. I'm not sure where they're going to go work, because that's a very specialized trade. So,
Sure. No, I think it just points out that really in any region, diversification in your workforce is so key. And I went to school in Scranton, Pennsylvania, and when the coal mines dried up,
Right.
Scranton became a ghost town. And obviously we have the biotech here, but the more different types of employment that we can bring here as we're looking to grow, and providing those, different kinds of opportunities attract, we still have a very highly educated workforce. So, the more we can be thinking about, different areas that might, be a good, good sectors for us to target.
Right.
I think it's a
Yeah,
good discussion to
and
have.
not to beat a dead horse, but I know one of the other concerns with the federal downsizing is, for example, the FDA and National Institutes of Health, right, is that those agencies actually spawn other jobs growth, right? So if now you have a reduction there, there may be a reduction in the desire for biotech research and things, because there's not this grant money around or whatever. I mean, there's all these things that can happen, right? I mean, we don't want to think too darkly about these things, but they could have more ramifications. So when you hear the 10% of federal workforce, it may, could translate into more than just, the 1% I was talking about in Gaithersburg. For the federal workers, it may end up being 2 or 3% of all workers in Gaithersburg are being affected because of these other
Dominoes.
related things. Yeah, but it's hard to say. The problem is it's one of those things where we almost have to sit and wait and see what's happening, because there's so much pushback from the unions and from other people. And
Right.
so,
Yeah, no, we don't, and we certainly don't want to, we want to prepare for the worst, but we want to hope for the
Right.
best, for sure. Thanks.
Lisa?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you, Kirk. This is a ton of data that you could truly get lost in.
yes.
One of the questions, one thing I just want to point out that you provided in your presentation is that not only are we a race minority majority city, also gender.
Yes, and that is typical of most of the country, believe it or not. Most of the U.S. is majority female, not male. And that's partly because women tend to live longer, so that's part of it.
I'm just going to pause here for a second. All right. Do you think there could be a correlation between the median age and the types of housing that are in the pipeline? Could it impact the median age and what we're seeing? And one of the reasons I'm asking is because as the median age is growing in one direction and we see population starting to slow a bit, will we start to try to attract age-restricted housing?
Yeah, and I think you're actually asking two
I
kind of
just-
different questions.
Yep.
In terms of age-restricted housing, yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that. In terms of, the type of housing and does it attract, say younger groups of people. So there is sort of this anecdotal idea that if you have, rental apartments, that typically is more attractive to younger people who are single or just young couples or people just starting out. Whereas the detached houses, the townhouses, those are more attractive to people who are farther along in their career, are able to afford it, able to afford the other maintenance and things that come along with the house, things like that. And in the pipeline, we have a lot of, rental multifamily apartments. We don't have as much of the townhouses and detached houses. So it's possible that, if we do attract a lot of more of the younger cohort, it's possible that the average age in Gaithersburg might start to move the other direction, although a lot of that is more driven by children and fertility rates, which have been declining, and so it's hard to say how much that would change. But it could change somewhat.
All right, it'll be interesting to watch.
Yes,
Thank you.
definitely.
Thanks.
Jamil?
When we were doing retool, I remember that we made some changes in terms of the expiration of, for example, SDPs that prior to retool, they did not have an expiring. Now they do. I think site plans have 2 years for an expiration. Do we have a listing anywhere here, like how much of the plan, like of the historical non-retool projects are not entitled, non-vested, but are sitting on approvals that are grandfathered under the old process that could maybe change or not change? Like what's that
Right.
universe
So-
look like?
And I haven't looked at it that thoroughly, but off the top of my head, I believe everything in the inactive pipeline that's, expired or stalled or whatever is actually under the old system. So basically, the reason they're in there is because there's either preliminary site plan approval or a schematic development plan approval, and those approvals before, did not have any kind of expiration date. So they are still valid approvals. So even though the final site plan may have expired, because they have a preliminary site plan, they can always come in and do a new final site plan and then get it reapproved and move forward. But yes, going forward, that's a very good idea, which I've also thought about, which is to identify in that report, the ones that actually have an expiration date, so that. And the thing is, once they pass that expiration date, and Rob or Greg can chime in if I say the wrong date, but I believe they're a 10-year thing
10
now.
plus we gave them.
Right, plus 3. So
yeah.
basically, after a certain amount of time, those would actually come out of the list because they actually have expired and they have no vesting approvals at that point. Whereas the old system, all the stuff that's in there right now, that's all just there. Unless, I'm not going to go in there. But
Well, I'm going to go there. So maybe that's I don't know if it's
something
a planning or a Frank question, which is, something that was approved under the old code but not yet vested or entitled, which was grandfathered, can be ungrandfathered, or we're stuck. So 20 years from now, 30 years from now, that's forever perpetual, or
Let's get Frank up here for this question.
can that be ungrandfathered at some point?
That's difficult to do just because of the concept of vested rights, and under the laws that were in place at the time, that was the power of the timeline to be put in, to put some sort of limits on that. And those rights do go decade after decade after decade. It's not to say there's not the possibility at some point to say, with enough advance notice, it is, if there are floodplain issues, for example, or if there are other public safety issues, there's some possibility, but largely that's going to be at the edges. So it's certainly something to keep in mind, but again, it's the vested rights scenario that we are largely stuck with.
Wait, but I thought we were that was the entire DRA discussions. We're a late vesting state, so you don't vest until that shovel hits the ground.
Well, although once you do have development approvals and once you're moving forward with that, now that's not to say that concept approvals or sketch plan approvals necessarily have the right to move forward. If there are zoning changes, certainly that could have an impact moving forward as well. But once you do have the SDP, that, at least for the core right to build those units, that does vest, and that does move forward. The DRRA granted vesting rights moving forward, applying a whole host of laws in addition to just the zoning that we're talking about. And part of what I'm also touching on is the possibility that there could be significant environmental changes or other changes that may also have an impact, but that wouldn't necessarily mean they couldn't be built. It may have some impact in how and what. What the DRRA did largely was remove some of those options, at least for a certain time period.
Thank you, Frank. That was it.
John.
Just a couple of random questions or thoughts, I guess. And maybe just to amplify that, I mean, we moved a lot of our development into the MXD zone, which has that unique condition of an SDP that does sort of live on in perpetuity. It's not like a Euclidean zone where it would have expired at some point, right? So, but no longer, right? With the new retool, we've got a little bit of a limit to that. I guess, so this is a question. So where does some of the more qualitative stuff live? So for example, there is a number of households or housing units versus population, but then there's part of that discussion probably needs to start moving toward how big and how old and how, some of the things that would inform some decisions about where focus on redevelopment might be at some point, or on what the likelihood of it being sustained for 10 years versus 50 years or something like that. Is that somewhere else? Oh, look, Rob's coming up. All right.
It'd be easier for me to answer. So we consider all that stuff. So as Kirk really mentioned, this is nutrient dense to do there, but this is really like the jumping off point. When we really get into things, as Neil had mentioned, the Cura study, things like that, the housing element, when we did that, we take this high level and begin the granular review to help really tell the story. So Kirk was talking about jobs to housing. Again, one of the things that gets lost with jobs to housing is you can be a cashier and you can be the vice president of a biotech firm, and there's still just one job apiece. So when you look at this, you really have to start drilling down. And that's sort of the metrics we use with the housing element to determine neighborhood turnover, because we were looking at the age, we were looking at the condition. We're taking a lot of this stuff, and when we begin the next round of transportation and land use element, which we're beginning preliminary work on, these are sort of the stories we're telling, sort of what was brought up. How do you mix residential and the commercial? If you remember during the housing element, very important to us was when you guys adopted our employment nodes. And the whole purpose of that was we wanted a core of areas that could house the jobs needed, that could afford the housing that's in the city. That's not stuff that you see in the dwelling and population report. That's where the dwelling and population data starts with that, but then we take it, refine it, go through the public engagement processes, have the discussions about, from a policy level, what's more appropriate.
Is that a one and done report, or are you doing it updates kind of like?
I think it's all, basically we've done it reactive to what is the long range planning project in front of us. So again, if we're doing a master plan, there's a lot of work. This isn't something that is consistently updated, but that's not saying there's something that can't be updated. As Kirk mentioned, the dwelling population report of the 80s is and 90s is very different than the one we see today. With the advent of Energov, Greg under his leadership, we're tracking a lot more things like ADUs. That's something we're going to be adding to the report. How many ADUs are coming in? The turnover stuff. So I think, again, summation of this, it's a great report. It has tons of stuff. It can help guide policy, can help guide direction, but it's not in and of itself the end all and be all. There's always additional analysis that has to occur and an engagement component with the public to really move stuff forward.
Great, thanks. And then just from another corner of this discussion, the issue of stalled projects, in whatever form you want to call it, expired, on hold, whatever, but the stalled projects that represent a fairly big chunk of potential development in the city. While there might not be legal or technical ways to take them off the table and get them back into the pipeline again as a different project, and I'm stepping across the line into policy, so I apologize. But if to the extent that can become a focus for a carrot rather than stick, if it can be an incentive, something other ways of thinking creatively about getting those unstuck and moving them forward, it seems like that could be that there might be a little bit of a red flag there, or something to look at in the fairly near future. If the market's not really supporting that development, then maybe there's another way for the city to get involved and figure out a way to move it forward on some other terms.
If I may, John, we had the Secretary of Housing and Community Development at the Economic Development Breakfast, and one of the things that he mentioned that I had not heard of was that there is state grants available for basically shovel-ready projects to help with some of those initial inertia things, and I think that is certainly an area that we should avail ourselves to and make our developers aware that maybe the state can help them kind of get from 0 to 1. So that might be an opportunity to jump on that.
Great.
Good point.
That's all I got.
Phil?
I think, first off, great report, great, these documents are fabulous tools for everybody here. And, like John, at the risk of straying into policy, the question this raises for me, all this, understanding growth trends, household trends, and how that has, progressed over time. I think everyone understands shrinking is bad, reducing population is bad, less tax base is bad. But beyond that, what is right for growth, right? What should we be targeting as a city for tax-based growth, income growth, household growth, population growth, and how does that tie to planning goals and objectives, right? Obviously, I don't expect you to have an answer for that. It's more of a hypothetical or a rhetorical question that is probably worth a little bit more study, like for comparable cities of our size.
I think Neil Harris might have some answers to that because it goes along with the questions he was asking before
Right.
years ago that got us into our visioning exercise. We were on that same track too. Sorry, Phil. I
No,
didn't mean to interrupt.
that was it.
Okay. Carol, you got anything?
The only question I have, I think, is not related is transit and thinking about the population as it ages and the stay-at-home people that work from home and the need for whether we drive our cars or take some other kind of advanced technology. So, Kirk, would that be something that would be more in another report?
So this one in the ACS section, it does include, the percent of people who are using transit to get to work, the percent of people who are saying, working from home, things like that. Now keep in mind that really that's just a kind of a snapshot, and also it's just for work, right? And we know that there's more than just work that you need to do in life, right? Sometimes you need to go to the store, sometimes you want to go see a movie or whatever. So, but unfortunately, because the idea is that, the most congestion and therefore the most pollution that happens from cars and whatnot, it's all during rush hour, which is people going from home to work. And so that's really the focus of all that. Okay. But yeah, certainly staff can look to see if there are other sources that do other surveys to see if there's some other information besides those. Certainly there are other methods to collect information about traffic besides just, asking people in a survey. We do have traffic counts that happen not just by the city, but by the state and other agencies. And those sort of help us show like what's happening with traffic volume generally, and not just during the peak period, but also, on the weekends and all of that. I know anecdotally, if anybody drives around, say to IKEA on the weekend on the Beltway, there's a little bit of traffic on the Beltway even on the weekend. Surprisingly, it's not just during rush hour. So yeah, I mean, there are other sources, but and then in terms of transit, again, transit's not just used for getting to and from work. It's also used for getting to and from entertainment and shopping and things like that, and seeing friends and all of that. So and a lot of that can come. We do have some of that information from Ride On and from Metro Bus and also Metro Rail and the MARC train, obviously. Although the MARC train clearly is really geared towards the journey to work, and not so much to the other items. And certainly in the transportation element, we'll probably have some more exploration of that aspect as well.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And I did want to point out, what John was saying about sort of, where else can you go with this? The report really is geared towards the city as a whole and how's the city looking and all of that. One of the things that we've done is our GIS team has put together a demographic viewer, which I believe they showed off to you guys a while back. And so when we were putting this presentation together, I started thinking, boy, why don't we have that link on our webpage? So we did actually have the web team add that. So there is the link to the demographic viewer, which does go, sub-level of the city. When you click in there, and there's a little disclaimer, you can actually look, within the city, as I was talking about, at a smaller level, you can actually start to see, the income for the city as a whole is X, but when you look down, you can see it's not really even across the city and things like that. But I just wanted to point that out. That's another way you can explore the information. Now, I believe this is using the 2022 ACS, and of course in our January report, we have the 2023 ACS. So we are working on getting this updated, and ideally we'd sort of have this archived somewhere so that you could look at different years of census data and things to trying to get it more, sort of like a deeper dive from the report than just looking at the report itself. But I just wanted to mention that as another thing. But as Rob mentioned, for specific things, staff sort of takes the initiative to really look at things in a deeper dive and try to draw conclusions from it, like with the housing element and whatnot. So.
No.
Lloyd?
No,
Sorry,
I just have a very specific question. ADUs, how are those counted? I know there aren't
Right.
many, but are they considered to be rentals? Are they considered to be single family?
So right now, we have a fair, we have just a few of those, about, I think, 50 or so maybe throughout the city. So it's not, and most of those are actually in Kentlands and Lakelands.
Right.
So there's not a lot of them right now. For right now, staff is considering them as, garden-style apartments, which have a not a super low persons per household ratio, but pretty low, much lower than like a detached house or a townhouse or something like that. So we do count them separately, and we do sort of estimate their population separately. And right now we're looking at them like that. The problem is they're sort of all over the place. Some of the ones in Kentlands are pretty big. They're like 2 bedrooms above a garage and 2 levels above a garage. And then some of them are much smaller. It's like someone's basement with a studio apartment in it or something. So. But for right now, we're just treating them in that respect. But staff may look at that more closely to see if there's if it makes sense to separate them into the ones that are detached, the ones that are part of a existing dwelling unit, or maybe the size or something. I don't know. It's one of those things where in the bigger scheme of things, you can add as much complexity as you want to a methodology, but then at some point it just gets so unwieldy that you're not really getting a lot of bang for the buck. Sometimes less is more and simple is better, and that's kind of the approach we've taken. So we've just sort of grouped those with the garden apartments and said that they're going to be somewhere to those, which,
Thank you.
for now, yeah.
All right. I wanted to open it up if there's actually nobody from the public in the room right now, but if anybody on Zoom, there are a few members on Zoom, if you'd like to speak on this topic, then use the raise hand button and I will call on you. So far, no takers, but maybe they're like trying to find the raise hand button. Okay, no takers. All right. Well, thank you all for being with us on Zoom. And Kirk, thanks again for this in-depth presentation. And I would commend to anybody in the public to refer to these reports on the city website and to take advantage of the GIS, the city's GIS map page. It is, as Lisa's saying, very, very cool, and lots of different demographic layers that you can stick on it and sort of get a graphical picture of our city. So thank you, Kirk. Appreciate it. I will remind everyone, let me just go to my calendar. The next regular meeting of the Mayor and Council is on Monday, March 17th, St. Patrick's Day. And we are having, I will remind everyone, also we have our St. Patrick's Day parade at Rio at 10 a.m. on Saturday. Please join us for that. It's going to be lots of fun. It's a cute little parade path, very short. It's just a sweet little parade. Join us. Until next time, let's do great things, Gaithersburg. We are adjourned.